Hello and welcome back to my channel. My name's Kaylee and these are my books. So for today's video, I have my top books of 2022. This year has been a great reading year and it was so hard to narrow down this list. I mean, I started out, I think I had like 50 books, but I was like, these are my top books. I was like, I cannot put out a video with 50 books in my top list. Like that's just not gonna fly. I was trying to narrow it down to 10. I ended up with 15, which I think is pretty impressive to have narrowed it down to 15. I read, for context, 312 books in 2022. So narrowing down these 312 books to my 15 top favorites, like, can I get a round of applause for myself? Thank you, thank you, thank you. But jokes aside, this was really hard to do, really difficult to narrow it down. And therefore, while this video is my top books of 2022, top 15, I do have them in order as well. I will be putting out videos where I talk about my top 15 romance books, top 15 thriller books, top 15 horror books, and top 15 fantasy and science fiction books, because there are so many books that I absolutely adored that I just couldn't put into this video. Starting with the book that is at the number 15 spot is Night of the Mannequins by Stephen Graham Jones. I don't own a physical copy of this. I really need to buy one since I loved it so freaking much. I gave this book 5 stars. I'm not going to say that about every single book because all of the books in this list I gave 5 stars to. But Stephen Graham Jones is one of my favorite horror writers of all time, and so I was very excited to read this novella by Stephen Graham Jones, and it has a shockingly low average rating on Goodreads, but I wasn't nervous because I find with a lot of horror books, especially horror novellas, the average rating is very low on Goodreads. So I went into this book with an open mind, knowing that my friend Lexi from Books with Lexi loves this book. I actually read this book for a video where I read Books with Lexi's favorite books, and I was blown away. This book is so creepy. I was so interested in what was going on, and I do kind of understand how people could be disappointed with this book because it is called Night of the Mannequins. If you're expecting a book about killer mannequins, you will be disappointed. That is a theme that is in this book, but this book is much more a psychological horror than it is like an action-packed monster horror, if that makes sense. But I just loved being deep into our main character's mind and seeing his thought process and seeing what happened throughout the book. It was just so entertaining, so interesting, and I had no idea where the book was going to go, where this novella was going to go, and I loved every second of it. The premise for Night of the Mannequins is basically we follow a group of teenagers, and we know right away, it starts out, the very first line in the book is most of them end up dying. And then we get launched into a scene where a group of friends is pranking one person in the group. That person works in the movie theater. They're in charge of counting to make sure the only people in the theater are the people that have bought tickets. And so they think it's going to be funny, they being the group of friends, think it's going to be funny to put a mannequin in their friend's movie theater. That way the ticket count is off and she might get in trouble with her boss until the boss realizes it's just a mannequin sitting in the seat. And they think it's hilarious until they all get up and walk away after the movie, and the mannequin gets up and walks away with them. However, like I said, do not go into this book thinking that it's going to be action-packed full of creepy mannequins. This is, again, much more psychological, much more slow-paced, just really delving into this character's mind. Parts of it lean into stream of consciousness, which is Stephen Graham Jones' style. I love Stephen Graham Jones books, and Night of the Mannequins tops the list for me. Okay, the book in the 14th slot is Reckless Girls by Rachel Hawkins. This was so much fun. This is a thriller that follows a bunch of rich people on boats that go to a deserted island just for a fun little vacation. But when a dead body shows up on the island, they're all stuck there until the authorities can come, and there might be a killer amongst them. I thought this book was so entertaining. If you are a atmospheric reader, if you are a seasonal reader, definitely save this until the summer because it has so many summer vibes with the tropical island setting. And this put me down a whole spiral into researching about rich people who own boats and what the laws are for people who own boats and how you can just go on some random land that no government seems to own, and like what are the laws there, what is legal, what is not legal, what can you do on boats, people that live in boats, how do they even like do that? How do you control a boat? How do you get supplies on the boat? How do you just navigate? How you avoid the storms? Like, this book really made me realize that there's a whole hobby out there, a whole lifestyle out there that I have no information about. And so I was so intrigued, not only in the mystery and the murders that were happening in here, but also just with the setting and the lifestyle that was displayed in this book. I had such a fun time with this, and this is the only Rachel Hawkins book I've really liked. And I'm hoping that I can like future releases from Rachel Hawkins and this isn't just a one-hit wonder for me. But overall, I had a great time with this book, and I highly recommend it to anyone that wants a fun thriller. Alright, and the 13th spot goes to The Charm Offensive. This is an adult romance book that is a male-male romance where we follow a reality television show that is a lot like The Bachelor, and one of the guys in this romance is The Bachelor, who is supposed to be dating all of these women, and the other guy that he falls in love with is someone on the crew for the reality television show. So it's got a bit of a forbidden romance thing going on because they're on this reality dating show and he's supposed to be falling for one of the contestants, not a crew member. And I just love the whole drama that the reality television show added to this book. I'm not someone that really likes The Bachelor or any kind of reality dating shows. Like, I just get a bit bored from them. But weirdly, I love when reality dating shows are in books. And so The Charm Offensive does it really well, in my opinion. And this is just a romance book I felt so many emotions during. It was one of those books I could not read with a straight face. I was sitting here being like, you know, just like freaking out because it was so cute and I was just loving every second of it. And I loved the mental health representation that was in this book. I felt very seen by a lot of the things that these two characters struggle with. And I definitely think that the mental health representation is what made me feel so attached to this book and what made me ultimately cry many times throughout this book, even though it's not even like a sad book. I was so emotionally invested in it. This is definitely my favorite traditionally published romance book of the year. Now in the 12th spot is Ashes of the Sun. I read this book and I read the book 2 in this series. This is a trilogy, but I haven't yet finished the trilogy. So this book or the second book, Blood of the Chosen, are kind of interchangeable in this spot. I loved book 1 and book 2 so much. This is an adult epic fantasy book with some sci-fi elements. A lot of my friends that have read this book describe it as gay fantasy Star Wars, and I totally agree with that comparison. And basically the premise is we follow a brother and a sister, but the sister showed magical abilities from a young age, so the Empire kind of took her away from her family, essentially kidnapping her because she had to become a member of the Empire's military force due to her magical ability. So she is indoctrinated from a young age. She gets taken when she is 5 years old. And so she becomes a force fighting for the Empire. Meanwhile, her brother witnessed her being kidnapped away from the family and grows up to be fighting against the Empire with a rebel force. And so we have this brother and sister who were separated from a young age, both fighting on opposite ends of this budding civil war. And I just think this book is amazing. The characters in it are so fun. This is super approachable adult epic fantasy, so if you're new to the genre, you should not be intimidated by this. I think it could work for a lot of people. But if you're a seasoned veteran in the world of adult epic fantasy, I think you'll really like this book too. The magic system is so cool, the world building was really fun to read about, and the character relationships throughout the story, like the character development that happens, was so satisfying and nice and wholesome at times to read about. And I loved every second of this book. I really need to read book 3 when it comes out. Not many books make me laugh, but this book made me laugh, this book and book 2 of the series. Like, it's just so good. Highly recommend for a fun, epic fantasy time. Now moving into the 11th spot, and that spot goes to Mary by Nat Cassidy. I freaking loved this book. This is a adult horror book that is kind of like a retelling of Carrie by Stephen King, but if the main character was going through menopause and with less magic throughout. This is a book I don't really want to give too much away for the premise, so I think that's all I'm going to give you, because I went into this book not knowing much at all about it, and I was so surprised at the directions this book took. It was so good. This is another book like Night of the Mannequins where you're so deep inside this character's head, and it's not necessarily a character you like or you care about, but they're so interesting and you just want to be in their head, even though it's a bad place to be. This book had so many things that I love in horror books, so many tropes that I love in horror books. Think of all the different horror subgenres that I love, and it is in here. I don't want to go too much into detail because, again, I don't want to spoil where this book goes, but it goes places. It goes into some dark places. And I just love the cover for this novel too. It's so unsettling in a very subtle, beautiful way, in my opinion. I love it so much. This is one of those books I was surprised actually took the number 11 spot, because I love it so much. And I thought it would be like top 5 books of the year, but that just tells you how many books in this list I am obsessed with, because I love this book. I love all of the books I've talked about so far. And this is number 11, like, oh my god. I've read so many freaking amazing books this year, and Mary is definitely one of them. And next up in the number 10 slot on the list is the Fever series. I only own the first 3 of these books. There's a lot more in the series. I only read the series up until we switch our main characters. So I think that was book 5 or book 6. I can't remember which one. But I read all the books where we follow this set of main characters and didn't read it where we switched to the different set of main characters, if that makes sense for people who've read the series. Because the series is technically, I think, 10 books long, but it kind of switches partway through. I binged this series. When I started the first book in the series, I couldn't read anything else until I had read Michaela's entire story. It's so much fun. This is a fantasy romance series, urban fantasy romance series set in Ireland, where the Fae are coming back and invading the human world. And Michaela, our main character, has been notified that her sister was murdered in Ireland. And so she travels to Ireland to investigate her sister's murder because it doesn't seem like the police are doing much. So she's going to take matters into her own hands. But when she's over there, she starts seeing all of these monsters, like monstrous monsters. I'm not talking like monsters, but they're kind of hot. I'm talking about like horrific blob monsters that seem to be eating people. And she is like, what the heck is going on, and how come no one else can see these? She quickly realizes that there's this whole magical world that is coming back into the human world, and that her sister's murder is connected to these magical creatures. This is a very, very slow burn fantasy romance. I mean, the romance doesn't even really start until like book 3 or book 4. So you definitely have to be interested in the fantasy plot to enjoy this series. But I was so interested in the fantasy plot, and I was so interested in the romance plot. I loved both aspects of the series. And I do want to let you know, though, that there's tons of triggers in these books, especially in one of the books later on in this series. There is graphic descriptions of SA. So this series is not for everyone, and I want to make sure you're aware of what you're getting yourself into, so please check trigger warnings for this series. And because of all these trigger warnings, I would classify this as dark urban fantasy romance. But I loved it. I adored this series. It was so bingeable, so entertaining, and I cared so much about these characters. I loved this series. I actually already am kind of wanting to do a reread since I binged all of them so fast. I feel like I could definitely do a reread and enjoy it just as much the second time around. Especially knowing where we're going from the beginning, it'd be really fun to then reread the beginning parts, knowing what unfolds. Because, I mean, as you've probably can tell from the premise, this series has a lot of mysterious elements too. So it's kind of part mystery, part thriller, part fantasy, part romance, part horror. Like, it's got a lot going on in it, and I loved it. Alright, the number 9 book on my list is The Weight of Blood by Tiffany D. Jackson. I don't own this book, unfortunately, so I can't hold it up for you, but it is up on the screen here. And I have a little asterisk next to this book because I specifically recommend reading this book through audio. I think the audio was incredible. The production of the audio is the best audiobook I've ever listened to. We have a full cast. We have some sound effects that aren't intrusive but just add to the enjoyment of the audiobook. This is a YA horror book that is another Carrie retelling, so it's kind of funny to have 2 Carrie retellings on here, both Mary and The Weight of Blood, but it just does Carrie better than Carrie does itself, you know? So The Weight of Blood is set in a high school in 2014, so not super far in the past or anything like that, where the high school is having their first integrated prom, meaning they're having their first prom in 2014 where both white students and black students attend together. This is a real thing that happens in America in some small towns in 2014. Tiffany D. Jackson writes about real life events and turns them into horror books for her YA audience. I think Tiffany D. Jackson is a genius, and this book is further proof of that genius status. Our main character in The Weight of Blood is a mixed-race teenager that has been white passing for most of her life but gets outed as being black in this novel, and she is essentially our Carrie character. This book does have some magic in it, and there is gore in this book too. There is definitely gore. This book goes dark. It is a heavy-hitting YA horror. It has a lot of social commentary in it as well, and as you can probably tell from the premise, this book has a lot of commentary about racism, and a lot of the horror is horror that revolves around racism. I think this book was brilliant, and I recommend this book for both YA readers and adult readers because I think it's heavy-hitting enough where even if you typically read adult horror, you are still going to enjoy this book. I thought all the characters were so complex and it had so many things that were completely relevant for our society today, and therefore I think this would be a great book to be taught in classrooms as well, because I think students would really enjoy it, but it would spark up a lot of really good conversations for high schoolers to have. Basically, I just want everyone to read this book. I think it's fantastic and I had a great time with it. So in my number 8 spot is Confessions. I unfortunately also don't own this book, but it is up on the screen. This is a thriller slash horror novel. I think in my top genres videos, I'm classifying this as thriller, but it's definitely a thriller with horrific elements. And this is a translated novel that was originally published in Japan. This is a book that is all about a teacher taking revenge on her students because she believes that her students are responsible for the death of her daughter. And it's about the teacher's actions in revenge and how this revenge kind of spirals out of control and affects so many more people than just the students she was trying to take revenge upon. This book goes there. It goes there. You don't think it's gonna go there, and then it goes there. This book's structure is really unique too, where we're following a couple different point of views, but all in chunk segments. So once we finish with one person's point of view, they're done. Their story has been told, and we move on to someone else's point of view. So some of the point of views kind of rehash what we've already been told in his past point of view, but with a completely new set of eyes, where it just shows how much personal bias can skew what is supposed to be an objective truth. And I found that structure so interesting because it's made me so suspicious of what I was being told from all these people. But it's not like they're lying to you. This is just their perspective on what happened. But perspective does not mean they're showing us the objective reality. And so mostly because of this structure paired with this wild plot, I think this book is brilliant, but it is super dark, so just know what you're going into. If you don't like dark stories, avoid this, but I loved it. Alright, in my number 7 spot is another romance, and this is Twisted Games. I read the entire Twisted series this year, and Twisted Games is book 2 in the series. These are all standalone novels, there's 4 of them, but I would recommend reading in order if you can. I say that hesitantly because the first book, Twisted Love, is the weakest book, so it's kind of a hard sell to be like, hey, struggle through this book that I thought was just okay, and then get to the masterpiece of Twisted Games, Twisted Love, and Twisted Lies. But in this list, I have specifically Twisted Games selected, even though I did love books 2, 3, and 4. This second book was just my favorite. This is a princess bodyguard romance. But it is not a fantasy romance, it's Princess Bodyguard set in our world. And all of the Twisted series have some elements of the plot that kind of lean mystery, lean thriller at times too, and I think that's why I love the Twisted series so much, because it is a romance first and foremost. Do not get me wrong, this is a smutty romance, but the plot is just so good. I love the plot in these books. For example, in this book we have a lot of political parts of the plot where she is a princess and she's trying to figure out her role in her country, and some people she thinks are allies are not actually allies, and some people she thinks are enemies are perhaps not really enemies, and there is a blackmail plot in here, there's a potential assassination plot in here. It gets intense at times. These are dark romances, but they're like light dark romances. So they're dark if you're comparing this to, you know, a light rom-com book, but they're not dark if you're comparing this to a lot of other dark romances out there. So this is like a gray romance. It's darker than light, but lighter than dark. And yeah, I just had such a fun time. This is another one of those romances where the whole time I was reading it, I was just squealing. And actually, Melissa from Book Bar gifted me this copy, so thank you so much for allowing me to now own one of my favorite books of the year. It's so pretty sitting on my shelves, and it's begging me. It's talking to me from my shelf saying, Kaylee, reread me. Abandon your TBR. Just reread this book. So my 6th book on this list is House of Hunger by Alexis Henderson. I freaking love this so much. This is Alexis Henderson's 2nd book. The first one was Year of the Witching, and I read that last year and loved it so much. I was so hyped for this book, and I'm so happy that this book absolutely lived up to the hype. It's just such a fun, atmospheric, gothic horror read. So this is not one of those books that has a super fast-paced, crazy plot. It really is a book that wants you to sink into the atmosphere and just appreciate the imagery that you're getting given. That you're given in this book. I don't know why I said it that way. So this is a story set in a different universe, not set in our world, that does have some fantasy elements because there is some world building in here. But basically the nobles in this society seek out blood maids. And it is close in nature to sex work, but instead of selling your body for sex, you're selling your body for blood. And the nobles take your blood and drink it. So it is vampire adjacent, but they're not necessarily vampires because they're not drinking the blood for sustenance. It's more like a weird rich people thing. I don't know about you, but I could totally imagine it being a weird rich people thing in our society too. Like when a rich person just has everything in the world they want, what else can they need but blood? But basically our main character in this story is desperate, needs a job, needs work, needs to move into a different place. And so she accepts the position as a blood maid in the House of Hunger, the noble House of Hunger. And it's just about her in this house giving her blood to these rich people, and creepy things start to happen, and being a blood maid might be more than she bargained for. Much like Year of the Witching, I would classify this book as a dark horror with fantasy elements. So if you like fantasy books and you are kind of scared of horror, you don't know where to start with horror, I would highly recommend House of Hunger or Alexis Henderson's other book, Year of the Witching, because these books have some fantasy elements. They have some things that are going to feel familiar to you, but then they just go dark and they have those horror elements as well. Because I know a lot of people that have loved this book that do not like fantasy books, so I don't think you should count this out if you dislike fantasy, but it's more like if you like fantasy and you don't typically read horror, give this a go. And this cover probably wins any cover contest I would ever have because it's beautiful. It's beautiful, it's creepy, it's perfect. I love it so much. And actually, I feel like the vibes of the cover really expertly tell you the vibes of the book. Just this beautiful, gothic, creepy cover to show a beautiful, gothic, atmospheric, creepy story. Okay, now moving into my top 5 books of 2022, and my 5th book is Sea of Ruin by Pam Godwin. This is a romance, very dark romance book where we follow pirates. And this story is a poly romance story. I don't want to give too many details about that because I feel like it does spoil a little bit of the plot if I give you too many details. If you want more details about the polyamorous aspects of the story, just let me know. But for now, that's all I will say about the dynamics of the relationships in here. But I first and foremost want to say that this book is so dark. It is so dark. Please do not read this thinking it's a fun pirate romance. It's not fun. I mean, it's fun at times, but it's horrible at times too. It's horrible, brutal, terrible things happen in the story. It's a hard read, okay? It is a hard read. And therefore, this book is not for everyone, and that is okay. Please do not feel like you should pick up this book based off of this video if you're not okay with some of the trigger warnings that happen in this book, because this book has so many trigger warnings, and it's not like a trigger warning for like a single sentence of the thing getting mentioned. It's like an entire chapter of the thing getting mentioned. So please check trigger warnings if you need to check trigger warnings. I just wanted to make that explicitly clear because I really don't want anyone going into this book not knowing what they're getting themselves into. Clearly, I like really dark stories. I mean, most of the books on this list are super dark, and this book is no exception. This book is incredibly dark. But this story is amazing. It was so entertaining. It's quite long for a romance. It is almost 500 pages, about 460 pages, but I loved every second of the story. I flew through it, and there were some twists in this book that I was shocked by. You don't expect a pirate romance to shock you with some plot twists, but this one did. It definitely did. And some of the shenanigans that we got up to in this book were so ridiculous, but so clever too. Like, there's one scene where it's just like, oh my god, are they really doing this? But it works. It totally worked. And while I don't want to give too many details away on the plot, and that's why I think I'm going to keep the synopsis just being a pirate polyamorous romance, you should know that the main woman in this book is a pirate captain, so she is a badass main female character, and her driving goal throughout the story is to find treasure that her dad, who is also a pirate captain, left behind for her. So this book definitely has a plot. It is very smutty, but it has a strong plot throughout the book as well. And while there were some elements that could be fantasy adjacent, this really is pirate romance, but of realistic pirates, not necessarily pirate romance in a fantasy world. Pirates were brutal, scary people, and that's how they are in this book. They are brutal, scary people in this book too. Alright, the book in the number 4 spot is Gallows Hill by Darcy Coates. I read so many books from Darcy Coates this year. I think I read like 9 or 10 books from Darcy Coates, and Gallows Hill was my favorite of all of them. I freaking loved it so much. This is Darcy Coates' newest release as well, and it is about a haunted winery. Basically, our main character inherits a winery that her parents ran, but her parents died mysteriously, and she was estranged from them. So she gets notified that in the will they left behind, she has suddenly been gifted this working winery. So she goes to visit it, but it seemed like there are some scary things going on at this winery, and she might have gotten a lot more than she bargained for. This book had so many fun twists and turns, and there was a moment in the middle of this book where I was incredibly skeptical about the logic. I was so scared that I was going to end up hating it because I just did not understand the way something was explained, and I should have just let the book continue because it all worked out. And so the book was brilliant because it did exactly what it was trying to do, and I got bamboozled. Which is part of why I love this book so much, because it tricked me. It totally tricked me, and it just made the payoff at the end so satisfying for me to read about. And this is a book that had so many scenes throughout where I was like, oh my goodness, if I was in this situation, I would totally be dead. There is no way I would be capable of handling what is going on. There is no way. But this is a horror book where you are rooting for the main characters. A lot of the horror books on this list so far are horror books told from the point of views of other horrible people, but this is a horror book that is told from the point of view of someone you're rooting for. You like these characters and you're scared for these characters. I love wine. I love visiting wineries too, so this setting was an A++ for me because I thought this haunted winery setting was so fun. And it definitely is an important part of the book. This is not just like in the background. The winery is important to the plot. And I just loved every second of learning more about the mysteries that were going on in this horror book, and I was so anxious while reading it in the best way possible. Alright, moving into my top 3 books of the year. Number 3 is Project Hail Mary. This book I read for the first time at the very beginning of this year, and then I reread it in August because I just loved it so much. This is a book that I would recommend to literally everyone, even people that don't even enjoy reading that much. I would still recommend this book to them. This is a science fiction novel, but like easy science fiction, and I don't mean to say easy in a way to diminish the book. I mean easy in a way that it's not like Star Wars level of science fiction. We're not like in different universes with like big wars and politics and things like that. This is a sci-fi novel that doesn't have as many fantasy elements in it. I'm basically explaining it this way because I don't want you to shy away from this book even if you don't typically like science fiction, because I think this is approachable for every type of reader. There is a friendship in this book that is the most perfect thing I've ever read about in my entire life, and this friendship is the number 1 friendship I care about from any book ever. The character moments in this book are top-notch, top-tier material. So basically the premise for this story is a man wakes up in a room with no memory of where he is, who he is, what's going on, but it seems like he is alone in space. And it's just about him trying to figure out how the heck he got up there, where everyone else is, who he is, what's going on, and it is so entertaining to read about. This has a lot of mysteries throughout it as well that become unraveled throughout the story. But I think someone that loves mystery books or thriller books would like this book because there are mysterious elements, there are thrilling aspects. I think if you like romance books, you would like this book. Not that there is romance in here, but I think a large draw of why so many people like romance books are for these character connections that we see happening. And even though it is platonic, there is just character connections, a character relationship in the story that is so satisfying and wholesome to read about. And then of course, if you like science fiction books, if you like fantasy books, I think you will like this too because it has a very fun science fiction plot. This is a book I will see myself continuously rereading until I die because it just gives me so much happiness every time I read it. My number 2 book of the year is House of Sky and Breath by Sarah J. Maas. This is book 2 in the Crescent City series, and the Crescent City series is my favorite series that Sarah J. Maas does, and I was blown away by this book. I loved it so much, and it just cemented the fact that the Crescent City series is my favorite series that Sarah J. Maas does. And I'm a big Sarah J. Maas fan. Like, I love every single book she's come out with, but this one is just so good. The ending of this book was like, what? I can't even talk about the ending of this book. I'm still in shock, and it's been months and months and months since I've read it. I immediately had to call up 4 different people who have no knowledge of Sarah J. Maas books. They don't read these books. They don't know what's going on. But I just had to talk about the ending to people. So I had to explain to people why this was so crazy, why this was so important. And I mean, I have very good friends that I was talking to because they did not care at all, but they were pretending like they cared for me. This was, of course, before my booktube channel. Now I have lots of people I could talk about this with that would actually care. But I'm just telling you all that so you can see how much this book meant to me. I am eagerly awaiting future books in this series. And I can't really give you a synopsis for this book because it is book 2 in a series, but this is Sarah J. Maas's adult epic fantasy series. And I think of all her series, this series much more focuses on this epic fantasy plot than it does on the romance plot. There is romance in this book, but for example, like, we don't even get like a smut scene in the first book until I think like page 500. So it's a pretty slow burn romance setup. And so I think you really need to be invested in epic fantasy plots to enjoy this Crescent City series by Sarah J. Maas, which is why I think this is my favorite series that Sarah J. Maas has done. And I just really quickly want to show you the end pages for this standard copy, and because they're just so freaking pretty, and I love that they did that. But yes, I had an amazing, incredible time with this book, and I can't wait for the next book to come out, and I will totally be rereading the entire series, books 1 and this book 2, before the next book comes out, just because I love these books so much. It's going to be such a pleasurable experience to reread them. And then my top book of the year, my number 1 book that I read in 2022 is The Poppy War by R.F. Kuang. This is an adult fantasy book that is brutal. First of all. There are some scenes in here that lean into horror for sure. And so this is one of the darkest fantasy books that I've ever read. So make sure you go into this book being prepared for what you're about to read. This book is about our main character, Rin, who, side note, is one of the best characters, most interesting characters I've ever read about. But Rin is from a poor village, and she grows up in this family where she doesn't feel a lot of love because she was an orphan and she was kind of adopted into this family. And they basically use her as just someone to work for them. And she is determined to make it out of this village. So she studies for these military test exams because if you test above a certain threshold, you get invited into these prestigious military schools. And so she studies really freaking hard and makes it into the top military school in this country ever. And this is huge news. This is scandalous because normally this school is only for people of upper class families, but here she is, a peasant, making it into this school. So it's just about her time at this school, training to become a part of the military, and eventually her impact on a war that seems to be brewing throughout this story. So this book does have a school setting for part of the story, and then it does have a military setting for the other part of the story. This is a military fantasy series, very, very dark military fantasy series, and there is some cool magic in here too that our main character learns as we learn about it too, which is one of my favorite tropes ever. I love learning about the magic with our characters. There are gods in this story. There are lots of politics in this story and really, really interesting combat. I adored this book. The other two books in the trilogy I have read, but specifically the first book, The Poppy War, is my #1 book of the year. Because books 2 and books 3 I did really enjoy, but just nowhere near as much as I loved this first book of The Poppy War. Alright, but those are my top 15 books of 2022. Thank you for sticking around. I'm not sure what I'm going to be able to edit this down to, but I just talked about these books for an hour, which is not great, but obviously shows my excitement for these books. Please like this video and subscribe for more content, and let me know down in the comments what your favorite books of 2022 are. Thanks so much for watching. Bye!